Hello, Internet. It's December 30th, 2022, and I just wanted to give you a brief primer on one of the major human rights concerns at the end of the year, the ongoing protests in Iran, known as the Woman Life Freedom protests. The proximate cause for the current wave of protests in Iran is the death of Mahsa Amini, the 22-year-old woman who was arrested on September 13th, 2022, for improperly wearing a hijab, the required head covering under Islamic law in Iran. Apparently, she was showing too much of her hair. Amini died in Kasra Hospital in Tehran on September 16th. Iranian police insist that she died of a heart attack while in police custody, but witnesses who were arrested with her attest that she was severely beaten by police in the van on the way to jail. Her family insists that her death was due to this mistreatment. Amini was buried on September 17th, and the protests against the government started at her funeral and quickly spread from there. It's important to look at the context in which these protests are taking place. The issue is not so much about the hijab itself. The traditional reason for women wearing a head covering in Islamic culture, and there are several different types of head coverings, is modesty. Women's hair is considered sensual and a temptation for men, and so women are supposed to keep their hair covered in public to prevent immorality. Many Muslim women worldwide voluntarily keep their hair covered in public, even in cultures where it isn't required, because they believe it prevents unwanted advances from men or serves as a sign of Muslim or ethnic identity. But the issue in Iran at the moment is not whether the hijab is modest or moral. It is about whether the government has the right to force women to wear it. And they do indeed force women to wear it, as Amini's case shows. We have seen widespread protests against the Iranian government in recent years, on and off from 2017 through 2019. But those protests were sparked by everyday economic concerns like the price of food and gasoline and the 11% unemployment, and people wanted the government to take more effective action. The 2022 protests, on the other hand, are focused on human rights concerns, specifically about women's rights and the right to protest peacefully. And the 2022 protests are different from their predecessors in other ways as well. First of all, these protests have been led by women, specifically young women from the universities. We have seen women in other protest movements in Iran, but they haven't led them. They are definitely running this one. And the young women are in the forefront in the demonstrations. They're often getting arrested and even killed. It is not unusual for universities to be hotbeds of social change, and Iran is no exception to that. Young Iranian women do not remember the 1979 revolution and typically don't regard the Ayatollahs with the same reverence as do their parents and grandparents. Furthermore, this protest movement includes people from many different social groups, men and women, Persian and Kurdish, urban and rural, upper, lower, middle class. The protesters removed their hijabs in public during these demonstrations to show their defiance of the government and even publicly call for the removal of the theocracy itself, down with the government. It is difficult to assess the size of these protests or how many people are involved in the movement because of its decentralized nature. We know that there have been protests on at least 140 university campuses across all 31 provinces of Iran. And as many as 18,000 people have been arrested during the present crisis, indicating that the government is indeed facing a mass movement. The Iranian government has taken a hard line against the protesters, deploying lethal force to disperse them. Casualty numbers are difficult to assess. Some human rights organizations put the count at no fewer than 470 deaths to date, including dozens of children. Protesters have been beaten, shot, and tortured. 2 protesters were executed by the authorities, and 12 more are presently awaiting execution. Several journalists have been arrested for covering the protests. The government has also made a point of arresting celebrities for criticizing the government, probably to intimidate the rest of the population. Taraneh Alidoosti, a popular actor in Iran, was arrested for publicly criticizing the use of the death penalty against protesters. Elnaz Rekabi, an Iranian rock climber who competed in South Korea without wearing a hijab as she was required to, is reported to be under house arrest after her return to Iran, and her family's home has apparently been demolished by the government. This protest movement is decentralized. There are no clear leaders, and the demonstrations are not coordinated. This demonstrates that the movement is a result of widespread displeasure with the government, its grassroots. It's not the result of a small group of troublemakers or foreigners, as the Iranian government claims. The decentralized nature also makes it more difficult for the government to combat it since there's no leaders to arrest. The problem with the decentralized movement is that it has no single achievable goal, and there's no one to coordinate the protesters and lead them in a particular direction. It tends to be very diffuse. Protests alone are very unlikely to bring down the Iranian government. Well, what about reforms and political reformers? Iran has in the past seen reformist politicians who try to change the situation from the inside. Many were involved in the Green Revolution of 2009. They don't want a revolution, these reformists. They just want a slow and nonviolent change to permit more civil rights as well as to do economic development. But the 2021 election of ultra-conservative Ebrahim Raisi to the presidency of Iran put an end to any hope for moderate change. By the way, in Iran, presidential candidates are chosen by religious leaders, ensuring that anyone favoring a secular government can never come to power. Many reformist politicians were subsequently imprisoned for speaking out against the government. With the moderate reformist weakens, it seemed that nonviolent change is an ineffective option in Iran, especially with the government's harsh response to the protests. But the movement still needs leaders and a definitive program if it hopes to push back against the Islamic regime. Until then, my guess is that the anger will continue to simmer in Iran and explode into angry demonstrations now and then until a leader steps up to channel that anger into a productive direction. Thanks for listening.